our brain is the control center of our health and function. It allows us to walk to work, it allows us to communicate with our friends and colleagues, to have dinner, to digest that dinner, to have a good night's rest, and then feel recovered the next day. And while it seems super straightforward and simple, this fact really kind of sunk in after 10 years of doing neuroscience research. And so I'm just going to quickly walk through what that journey looked like for myself to you guys. I started my research journey in the animal world. My first ever research project was sitting in a cafe the summer before I started college at Johns Hopkins, where I basically went through videos of fetal mice moving in the womb. And what I was doing was manually labeling, because this was before AI, the movements of these fetal mice, and basically studying how those movements impacted their neurological development after birth. And so that was really the first time that I understood that behavior and the brain are really, really tightly linked. And then after that, I did some courses, and I wanted to move towards a different type of animal model. So I spent a summer at the NIH, basically in front of a microscope dissecting fruit fly. And what I was doing was dissecting out their entire nervous system and figuring out how that nervous system actually controlled their movement. So then I transferred that idea of course, the brain controlling movement to the human brain. And I then studied how damage to the brain actually impacted movement. So I was working with patients of stroke and working with during their rehabilitation process and understanding how even a small piece of damage can impact how someone can walk or talk or feed themselves. And then after that, I was like, okay, the brain is clearly very good at controlling things. It has a huge role in allowing us to move and to speak. But what about sensory processing? So I then spent some time trying to understand, okay, when we move through the world, how do we know that we're moving through these different places, and how do we recognize things? And of course, vision is a big part of that. So I spent some time then trying to figure out how the brain, actually processes light and allows us to understand what we're interacting with. And during that time, I was trying to basically model this system with neural networks. So again, before ChatGPT. And what I came away with is, okay, still the brain is really powerful. Even just this one system comprised of so many different layers that a single model is really difficult to replicate. And then finally, when I reached the point of, okay, I want to do grad school, I spent 4 years of my Ph.D. basically trying to understand at a high level how cognition, and particularly memory, was encoded in the brain. And so I basically watched my supervisor implant these really tiny neural implants into the brains of patients with epilepsy, and I would take that data and try to decode it for memory. And during all this time, I was like, okay, the brain is super important, the brain's super fascinating, the brain is obviously very complex. But it wasn't until towards the end of my grad school, this paper that I had been working on during undergrad, which if anybody's tried to publish a paper, it takes years for it to actually come out. And when it came out, I reread that work, and the title was Cognitive Decline in Diabetes. You know, it's a review of how diabetes actually causes or directly relates to cognitive decline. And that's when I suddenly realized that, you know, when I've been studying the brain, I've always been viewing it as this kind of siloed organ or the silo system. But in many ways, everything that we do that impacts our physical body also impacts our brain. And so to take a step back, I want to basically ask, you know, what is cognition? What is cognitive function? Right, so scientifically speaking, cognition is the mental process through which we acquire knowledge, and that's through experiences, through senses, through thinking. And in practice, what it really means is our ability to learn, our ability to remember and recall and make decisions. And so at the crux of it, cognition actually sits at the intersection of health and function, or productivity for this matter. Everybody in this room uses cognition every single day. In fact, we probably use a lot of cognitive energy in our day jobs. And everybody's probably felt it when they've had a really long day, and not only is your body tired, but your mind and your brain is also tired. And so another question is, how often or when do you think our cognitive state or cognitive function changes or declines? Most people, and we've kind of done a survey on this, think that cognition declines in our 40s and 50s, but in reality, certain types of our cognition actually peaks in our 20s and 30s. So it impacts a lot more people in this room than we may initially think. And at the same time, cognitive states actually fluctuate day to day. So it's not just this one big function that when we become older suddenly starts to decline. It's broken down into all sorts of different factors or functions. And from a day-to-day level, how this manifests for us is through some of these words that you guys might recognize. So feeling distracted means lower attention, feeling wired means higher attention, feeling brain fog means lower mental clarity, and saying things like I can't remember is obviously an indicator of disrupted memory. But when we talk about the brain, we often think of it again as this separate kind of system. Meanwhile, it's actually impacting our day-to-day. And yet we don't really have the vocabulary to describe it in the same way that we do with our physical health. And at the same time, when we think about health, we often think about exercising, eating healthy, tracking sleep, making sure we drink water because it helps with our physical performance. But then when it comes to our cognitive performance, our cognitive health, it's kind of an afterthought. How do we actually think about our cognitive health? How do we talk about it? How do we measure or improve it? And so today, when we talk about unlocking cognitive performance, there's really 3 things that we should be thinking about to reframe how we approach this topic. Our cognitive performance is not a separate function that is unrelated to our physical health because, again, back to kind of what I was saying earlier with my research, if our brain doesn't work, then our physical bodies also doesn't work. And so the first piece to unlocking cognitive performance is acknowledging that, is to understand that the brain is not this kind of separate organ. And we actually all have probably felt this before. For example, if anybody has done a cold plunge, we hosted one yesterday at Chrissy Field, you've probably felt this heightened energy after you dive into the water. Or if you're really anxious and you take deep breaths, it helps calm down your anxiety. Eating a big bowl of pasta can increase serotonin in your brain, which is why we feel drowsy after. If you're a runner, you've probably felt runner's high. And on the more extreme side of things, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension are all really significant risk factors for cognitive decline and dementia in later on years. And so acknowledging that the brain is part of this health that we're trying to take care of and trying to elongate is the first step in really kind of reframing how we think about brain health and brain function in cognitive performance. The second point is that we need a common vocabulary, because if we don't know how to describe something, how do we know what we're actually trying to optimize? Somebody earlier, before we started the event, asked me, when we think about cognitive health or cognition in general, like what are we actually talking about? We had said, okay, memory is something, maybe decision-making is something, but for example, if we're saying, okay, we're trying to measure temperature for a fever, we're trying to measure temperature for an illness versus measuring temperature because it's hot outside. And so instead of saying, oh, I have brain fog or I'm in flow state, what are the real cognitive states that we're actually trying to optimize? That's what we need the vocabulary for. So some of these things might include mental clarity, which encompasses our ability, our sharpness in thinking and processing information. We can talk about I think we're good. Okay. We can talk about cognitive load, which is, again, mental effort, how much, not physical effort, but mental effort we need to do a task, to stay attentive in a meeting, to hold a conversation. We can talk about things like stress, which is not so much physical stress, but tension and strain on our minds. We can talk about engagement, which encompasses attention and how much we're in focus or contributing to a conversation. And then finally, of course, we can talk about our overall cognitive fitness, which encompasses all of these different pieces. And lastly, once we can understand and acknowledge that the brain is part of our overall health, and we have these new vocabularies to actually describe these different states that we want to optimize, we then actually need to be able to measure it to be able to optimize it. I've spent the last 10 years doing research and using all sorts of different tools for measuring the brain. And as patients and consumers or individuals, we might be able to go to the doctors to get an MRI or get a cognitive test if we have a concussion. But those things are quite expensive. They're quite inaccessible if we want to do it continuously. And in today's world, there's the kind of what I just talked about, the MRIs of the world, where there are these big machines and you have to go into the doctor's office to get those scans. And then, of course, there are the neuroimplants of the world, like the Neuralinks of the world, that are trying to implant your brain with a chip. And those things are, of course, much more portable. They're much more accessible in some ways, but way too invasive for the average individual. And then there's this emerging kind of space of technology where we're trying to translate some of the technologies that are used in the clinic, like EEG, for consumers to then measure their brain state. But even those technologies are still quite difficult to use and wear, and the signal itself is not necessarily insightful. And so at the end of the day, we still need a way to continuously, non-invasively, and ambiently measure our brain health in the same way that we can with our step count, with our sleep, and with our temperature. And so just to kind of recap, when we talk about cognitive function or cognitive performance, what we're really talking about is our ability to perform at our best at work, during our socializing days, and our ability to recover. And we can't improve that without first understanding that the very organ that controls and allows us to do all that is very tied to actually everything else that we're trying to improve, from our muscular strength to our cardiovascular health to our respiratory health. And we can't improve it without first defining what we're trying to improve beyond just the fact that we're trying to help our brain health. And lastly, we can't improve it without measuring it. And what we're trying to do is, at a high level, recenter the conversation around health and around productivity so that we're including the brain and including cognitive function into that conversation. By building the world's first cognitive fitness tracker, we're using a non-invasive and continuous and ambient platform to help you actually measure all the different states that we were just talking about. So for example, if you take creatine, I actually had my first creatine drink right before this talk, and so I'm very curious how it's affecting my brain health and my cognitive performance. But we're using creatine, we're exercising because it helps with our memory or with our mental clarity. We sleep better because it helps us perform better. But how do we know how well those things are actually working? Without measuring and without quantification, we won't be able to know. And so at Soma, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to quantify these different mental states and actually connect it back to our physical health. So if you're a runner, we'll be able to say, okay, over the last 3 months, how has your runs and your run schedule and your run intensity actually helped with your cognitive performance or your mental clarity? If you take creatine, we can say, how many grams of creatine actually optimize your cognitive performance? And if you have trouble sleeping, what times should you actually fall asleep or try to sleep to be able to decrease your overall mental stress throughout the day? And by doing this, we can then actually say, okay, these are the different behaviors and the different habits that will actually help me understand what is affecting my brain, because again, all of these different habits we already do, so we're not asking to change your behavior in any way. We're just then helping you understand how those behaviors actually affect your cognitive performance. And so with that, I want to conclude by saying that this is, beyond building frontier technology at Soma, what we're really trying to do is to start a movement around recentering brain health and recentering cognitive performance into the conversation of health and productivity. I would love to invite all of you guys to join our waitlist for the beta that will be launching privately soon.